At 27, she was a widow with nothing but a deed her husband's family said was worthless, and a cabin that leaked wind through every seam. The world had decided Willa Graves would be gone by the first hard frost, another casualty of the high Colorado mountains. But a small, gray cat knew a secret buried in the earth, a truth made of stone and patience. And what nobody in the valley understood was that the quiet woman they had written off carried a memory of how the world truly worked, a lesson learned from a man who knew how to read the deep rock. This is the story of the winter that was meant to break, and the small, warm room that changed everything. Stay close and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The road that led past the Graves homestead in the autumn of 1884 was little more than a suggestion cut into the hillside, a pair of ruts that would dissolve into mud with the rains and vanish completely under the first significant snow. From that road, a traveler would have seen the cabin as a punctuation mark of human hope against a vast, indifferent sentence of pine and granite. It was small, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud that was already crumbling, and its stone chimney listed slightly to the east, as if weary of the prevailing wind. Beside it stood a leaning woodshed, its contents looking meager against the scale of the coming winter. This was the picture of a place on the verge of being reclaimed, a foothold already slipping. Inside this picture, a solitary figure moved with a rhythm that was too deliberate for desperation. Willa Graves worked the sawbuck, her arms pulling and pushing a two-man crosscut saw alone. The blade sang its metallic, lonely song, biting through a fallen ponderosa pine she had spent 3 days dragging down from the tree line. Each pull was a testament to a stubbornness the valley had mistaken for foolishness. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead for 4 months, his lungs filled with rock dust and the promises of a silver vein that never paid. His brother, Silas, had arrived 2 weeks later, not with comfort, but with a lawyer from Denver. The papers had been laid on the rough plank table inside the cabin, the air thick with the smell of pine resin and Silas's disapproval. His wife, Elspeth, had remained on the porch, her gaze sweeping over the property as if assessing inventory. The claim, Silas explained in a tone of practiced patience, was that Thomas had built the cabin on land secured with a loan from the family, a loan for which the deed was collateral. With his death, the collateral reverted. It was a clean, legal argument that ignored the sweat Thomas and Willa had poured into the soil, the calluses on their hands, the shared belief that this place was theirs. "It's a matter of business, Willa," Silas had said, not meeting her eyes. "The family cannot carry the liability." He had offered her passage back east, a ticket on a train that would take her away from the only home she had ever truly known. She had looked at the papers, at the fine, looping script that erased her life, and had given him her answer. "No," Silas had sighed, a man burdened by the unreasonableness of others. "Be sensible. You cannot survive a winter here alone. The cabin is barely fit for habitation. You have no money, no reserves." He gave her a deadline. She was to be gone before the first snows closed the pass. If she remained, they would not be responsible. The words hung in the air. They would wait for the winter to do their work for them. She had not moved. She had simply watched them ride away, their backs straight and certain, until they were small figures swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. She had not moved on. She was still there, turning a dead tree into warmth, one measured stroke at a time. The consensus in the small settlement of Jasper's Fork, 5 miles down the valley, formed quietly but with the certainty of a river freezing over. It began with Mr. Henderson at the general store, a man whose ledger was a precise measure of community standing. When Willa came for flour and salt, her credit, which had been good while Thomas was alive, had suddenly evaporated. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Graves," he'd said, his eyes fixed on a point just over her shoulder. "With winter coming on, I've got to be careful. Cash only from here on out." The women of the church sewing circle spoke of her in hushed, pitying tones, a poor, unfortunate soul clinging to a ghost. The pastor himself, Reverend Gable, paid her a visit, his horse steaming in the crisp October air. He spoke of God's mysterious ways and the comfort of accepting His will. But his eyes kept straying to her dwindling woodpile and the darkening northern sky. He offered prayers, but not a cord of wood nor a sack of potatoes. The town was not cruel, not actively. It was practical. It saw a problem with only one logical solution, and it turned its face away, allowing nature to provide the inevitable answer. They expected she would leave any day, a forlorn figure with a small bundle, walking the road toward the stagecoach depot before the path became impassable. Every sign pointed to a winter of unusual severity. The old hands in the valley noted the thickness of the beaver pelts and the early, frantic industry of the squirrels. The woolly caterpillars wore thick bands of black. The almanac, a text treated with near-biblical authority, predicted a season of deep and punishing snows, beginning in early November. The air itself felt different, holding a sharp, crystalline edge that promised a cold that would find every crack and weakness in a man-made structure. The community read these signs and doubled their efforts, laying in stores, chinking their own cabins, wrapping their wellheads in burlap and straw. In their minds, Willa Graves was already a ghost, a cautionary tale to be told by the fire on a January night. They did not see the calculations she was making, the quiet observations that had begun to form a question in her mind. Her refusal to leave was not born of grief-stricken denial, but of a focus that was narrowing to a single, strange inconsistency. The source of this focus was her cat, a small, slate-gray creature named Cinder she had inherited from a miner's wife. Cinder was a creature of comfort and warmth, and as the nights grew colder, its behavior grew stranger. Every day, regardless of the biting wind or the spitting sleet, the cat would vanish for hours. It would slip out the cabin door and make its way to the large, untidy woodpile stacked against the dirt bank behind the cabin. And when it returned, squeezing back through a gap in the doorframe, it was never cold. Its fur was dry and carried a faint, clean scent of damp earth and stone, and a strange, deep warmth radiated from its small body, as if it had been sleeping by a stove that Willa did not possess. At first she thought little of it, but, as the pattern repeated, day after day, she began to watch more closely. The cat was her silent companion, the one living thing that shared her isolation, and it was holding a secret. One afternoon, as the first true snowflakes of the season began to drift down from a leaden sky, Willa stood at her small window, watching the woodpile. Cinder had disappeared behind it an hour before. The cabin was already cold, the fire in the hearth little more than a flicker against the encroaching chill. She knew then that she could not outlast the winter in this drafty box. Her survival depended on something else, something she did not yet understand. It was hidden somewhere in the patient logic of a small, warm animal. The knowledge that would save her was not her own. It was a legacy from her husband, Thomas, transmitted not in a will or a testament, but in quiet moments of shared observation. Thomas had been a miner for 10 years before he'd met her, a man who did not just work in the earth but understood it. He read rock the way other men read books, seeing the story of pressure, time, and temperature written in the strata. He knew the deep places of the world held a different kind of time, a different kind of weather. She remembered a day the summer before, when he had begun digging into the hillside behind the cabin. He was planning a root cellar, a proper one, not just a pit in the ground. He had chosen the spot with care, where the granite shoulder of the mountain pushed down into the soil. She had brought him water, watching as his shovel struck the packed earth with a steady, rhythmic thud. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand, and looked at the hole he was carving. "It's a funny thing, Willa," he had said, his voice soft. "You get a few feet down, and the world changes. Up here, the sun burns you one day, and the frost freezes you the next. But the earth remembers. It holds the summer's heat deep inside, and it never truly forgets. He had explained it to her, then, the principle he had learned in the deep silver mines of the San Juans. The shafts, even in the dead of winter, with 20 feet of snow on the surface, never dropped below freezing. The sheer thermal mass of the surrounding rock acted as a colossal reservoir of stable temperature. Geothermal stability, he'd called it, a term that sounded like science and poetry at once. The earth itself is a stove if you know how to use it, a slow, gentle stove that never goes out. He had planned to dig 20 feet into the hillside, line it with stone, and connect it to the cabin with a small, insulated tunnel. It would be a place to store their harvest, a larder that would keep potatoes from sprouting and apples from spoiling. He had spent weeks on it, quarrying stone from the creek bed and hauling it up the slope on a makeshift sledge. He had finished the chamber itself, a masterpiece of dry stack stone taught to him by an old Welsh miner, but he had died before he could build the entrance or the tunnel. After his death, in her grief, she had stacked the firewood he had cut against the rough-hewn timbers he had set to frame the opening, burying his last project from sight and from mind. She had stored the memory of his words without knowing their value, a piece of knowledge she believed was merely a curiosity, a bit of miner's lore. Now, standing in the growing cold, watching the snow begin to accumulate on the ground, his voice came back to her with the clarity of a church bell. The earth remembers. She looked at the woodpile, at the spot where cinder disappeared, and then at her own hands, chapped and sore from the saw. Belief and knowledge were not the same thing. He had believed in the principle. She was about to find out if it was true. Her first task was to move the woodpile. It was a monument to a future that had not arrived, nearly a full cord of pine and aspen, split and stacked by Thomas's hands. She began on the morning of November 3rd, a day of brittle, blue-sky cold. She worked methodically, moving each piece of wood from the pile against the hillside to a new stack she started near the cabin's front door. The labor was immense, her muscles screaming in protest against the repetitive strain of lifting and carrying. It took her 2 full days, her world shrinking to the weight of a log, the ache in her back, the sting of splintered wood against her skin. By the evening of the second day, she had revealed what lay beneath, a rough but sturdy door made of 3 thick planks of pine, braced with iron and set into a heavy timber frame sunk deep into the earth. There was no handle, only a small gap where the planks had warped. It was sealed, not with a lock but with time and neglect. Using the pry bar from Thomas's tool chest, she worked it into the gap, leveraging her full weight against it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groaning crack of frozen wood, the door shifted. She worked the bar for another 10 minutes, the sound of her own ragged breathing loud in the still air, until the door scraped open a few inches. The air that flowed out was not the frigid air of the outside. It was cool, still, and smelled profoundly of damp stone, fungi, and a deep, patient darkness. It smelled alive. She forced the door open wide enough to slip through, carrying a lantern. The chamber was exactly as Thomas had described his plan. It was rectangular, roughly 8 feet wide by 10 feet long, with a ceiling just high enough for her to stand upright. The walls were a marvel of tight-fitting, uncut river stone, each one chosen and placed with an artisan's care. The floor was packed earth. It was empty, a silent stone womb waiting for a purpose. She hung her one reliable thermometer from a nail Thomas had driven into a ceiling beam. Outside, the temperature was hovering around 22 degrees Fahrenheit. She closed the door as best she could, stuffing a burlap sack into the gap, and went back to the cabin to wait. An hour later, she returned. The lantern's light fell on the small glass tube. The mercury inside read 48 degrees, a 26-degree difference, maintained by nothing more than the stored ancient warmth of the planet. Now the real work began. She spent the next week transforming the unfinished cellar into a sanctuary. She used clay mixed with straw and water to chink the stone walls, sealing every minuscule gap against drafts. She did the same for the door, creating a tight seal around the entire frame. Ventilation was the next problem. Thomas had warned her of the dangers of bad air in confined spaces. She found a length of old stovepipe in the shed, and using a hammer and chisel, painstakingly knocked a small, round hole through the timbers above the door, fitting the pipe through it to draw in fresh air. For the floor, she tore up the extra planks stored in the rafters of the shed, laying them over the packed earth to create a barrier against the damp. She moved her narrow cot into the chamber, along with her chest of clothes, the sacks of flour and beans, and the jars of preserves she had put up in the summer. She brought in a small crate to serve as a table and her rocking chair. Each trip was a deliberate act of relocation, a slow abandonment of the cold, drafty cabin, and an embrace of the quiet, steady earth. The first true test came on the night of November 15th. A storm blew in from the north, a front of such ferocity that it seemed to be a declaration of war by the winter. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, and fine, stinging snow drove through the cracks in the log walls, dusting the floor in white. Inside the main cabin, the temperature plummeted. Water in a bucket by the door froze solid. The ink in its well on her writing desk turned to slush. To stay in that room would have required burning through a quarter of her woodpile in a single night, a pace she could not possibly sustain. Instead, she lit a single tallow candle for light, took Cinder in her arms, and retreated into her earthen chamber. She sealed the door behind her, packing the last cracks with strips of cloth from an old quilt. The roaring of the wind instantly softened to a distant, hollow moan. The air was still and cool, but not cold. It was the absolute, profound quiet that struck her first. It was the silence of the deep earth, a quiet that felt ancient and secure. She placed the candle on the crate, its small flame barely flickering in the draft-free air. She sat in her rocking chair, wrapped in a wool blanket, the cat a warm, purring weight in her lap. She did not feel like a survivor clinging to a thread. She felt a sense of profound, unshakable security. After an hour, she checked the thermometer. The single candle, combined with her own body heat and the cat's, had raised the temperature inside the chamber to 54 degrees. She walked the few steps to the door and cracked it open. The wind blasted in, a physical blow of cold that felt like it was minus 20 degrees. It was a lethal, killing cold. She sealed the door again, the silence rushing back in. That night, belief became knowledge. The principle Thomas had spoken of in the summer sun was no longer an abstract idea. It was a physical reality wrapped around her, a shield against the indifferent fury of the storm. She thought of him, of his hands, calloused from the pick and the shovel, and felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it was almost a physical presence in the room. He had not known he was building her a lifeboat, but he had. His understanding of the world, earned in darkness and danger, had reached across death to give her shelter. She had not just found a room. She had found the tangible proof of his competence, a final gift of his love expressed in stone and soil. She slept that night more deeply than she had in months, a calm and dreamless sleep, while the blizzard raged above, burying the world in a deep, white silence. When she awoke, the candle had burned down, but the air was still and life-sustaining. Survival was no longer in doubt. The only question that remained was the matter of its long and patient execution. In early December, after a week of clear, brutally cold weather, she received her first visitor. It was Mrs. Gable, the pastor's wife, a woman whose charity was sincere but often misdirected. She arrived on a sleigh, her face wrapped in scarves, clearly on a mission of grim discovery. She expected to find the cabin either empty or occupied by a woman in the final stages of freezing. Willa met her at the door of the main cabin, which she now used only for cooking on the cast-iron stove, and as a sort of cold storage antechamber. The room was frigid, their breath pluming in the air. "Willa, my dear," Mrs. Gable began, her eyes wide with a mixture of pity and alarm. "We were so worried," the pastor said. "We thought you would have gone." "I'm managing, thank you," Willa said, her voice even. Mrs. Gable looked around the icy room. At the unlit hearth, the frost on the window panes. She saw no evidence of a survivable situation. Yet Willa herself, though plainly dressed, looked healthy. Her cheeks had color. Her eyes were clear. She was not shivering. The scene did not compute. "But how? You have no fire," the woman stammered, gesturing toward the cold chimney. "I have what I need," Willa replied, offering no further explanation. Mrs. Gable left 10 minutes later, deeply perplexed. The story she told in town only deepened the mystery of the widow Graves. She was there, she was alive, and she was somehow doing it without burning the impossible amount of wood it would require. 2 weeks later, a far less welcome wagon pulled up. Silas and Elspeth had returned. They had likely heard the rumors in town and had come to see for themselves. They dismounted, their faces hard and set with disbelief. They clearly expected to find her gone, the cabin abandoned, their claim ready to be finalized. Finding her alive and present was an inconvenience that bordered on an affront. "Willa," Silas said, his tone clipped. There was no pretense of concern this time. "We heard you were still here. This is foolishness." Elspeth stood behind him, her arms crossed, her gaze sweeping over the cabin with undisguised contempt. "How are you managing this?" Silas demanded, his eyes darting around, looking for the trick, the hidden benefactor, the source of supply he had missed. "I am managing," Willa repeated, her calm a wall he could not breach. She stood in the doorway of the cold cabin, blocking their entry, giving them nothing. Her refusal to perform the role of a desperate, freezing victim infuriated him. He took a step forward, his voice dropping to a low, cruel register. "The real cold hasn't even started yet. You think this is clever, staying here out of spite? You'll be a frozen corpse by February. Let the winter have you then. We'll be back in the spring for what's ours." They turned without another word and climbed back into their wagon. They did not look back. The threat was no longer veiled in legal language. It was a plain and simple death sentence, delivered with the quiet confidence of people who believed they had nature on their side. Willa watched them go, her expression unchanged. She felt no fear, only a cold, clear certainty. They had mistaken her knowledge for luck and her endurance for spite. It was a mistake they would come to regret. She turned and went back inside, not to the cold cabin, but to the quiet, steady warmth of the earth. The winter of 1884 arrived in earnest just after the new year. It came not as a single storm, but as a siege, a relentless wave of Arctic air that settled over the high country and refused to leave. For 3 weeks, the temperature never rose above zero, and on many nights it plunged to 30 and 40 degrees below. The sky was a pale, merciless blue, and the sun was a distant, heatless disk. The snow that had fallen earlier was transformed into a dry, crystalline powder that squeaked underfoot. It was a cold that broke things. Iron axles, tree limbs, the spirits of men. The wider community, for all its preparations, began to suffer. The omniscient, indifferent cold was a master strategist, finding the single point of failure in every system. The Miller family, whose ranch was 2 miles up the creek, lost a dozen head of cattle when the roof of their hastily built lean-to collapsed under a sudden, heavy snow load. They found the animals frozen solid in the morning light, statues of a failed calculation. Dr. Adams spent 2 days trying to reach a homesteader's wife in labor, only to have his horse go lame in the deep drifts. The baby was born and died before he could arrive. At the general store, Mr. Henderson's stock of coal oil ran low, and families began to ration their light, spending their evenings in darkness. The pastor's sermons took on a grim, fatalistic tone, speaking of Job and the trials of faith. In contrast, Willa's life fell into a quiet monastic rhythm. The deep snow that crippled the valley became her greatest ally. It buried her small chamber under a 6-foot blanket of white, providing an additional layer of insulation so perfect that it seemed designed for the purpose. The temperature inside her stone room now held at a steady 56 degrees, day and night, without any heat source other than her own body and the occasional candle. She had become a creature of the earth, living within the landscape rather than upon it. Her days were marked by simple, essential tasks. She would cook one meal a day in the main cabin, a pot of beans or a thick stew, using a minimal amount of firewood. The heat from the stove would briefly warm the icy cabin, but she spent no more time there than necessary. The rest of her time was spent in the chamber, mending clothes by the light of a single candle, reading the few books she owned, checking her supplies. She kept a journal, a simple log of temperatures, weather, and food stores, a discipline of mind that kept despair at bay. The contrast between her quiet, ordered survival and the growing desperation in the valley was the silent argument that proved her right. Resources and community were no match for a single, correctly applied piece of knowledge. While others fought the winter, she was simply inhabiting a space where the winter could not reach. On the night the cold reached its dimensional nadir, when the mercury in her outdoor thermometer froze at its lowest marking of -40 degrees, Willa sat in her rocking chair, listening to the profound silence. She placed a hand against the cold stone of the wall and could feel, or imagine she could feel, a deep, slow pulse from the heart of the mountain. It was the patient, steady warmth of the world, and she was a part of it. The crisis arrived in the form of a frantic pounding on the outer cabin door late one night in the 3rd week of the deep cold. Willa, roused from a light sleep, pulled on her boots and heavy coat and made her way through the frigid cabin. Outside, illuminated by the stark blue light of the moon on snow, was John Miller, his face a mask of frost and terror. "Mrs. Graves," he gasped, his words coming in ragged clouds of vapor. "You've got to help us. Our chimney, the mortar failed. The cabin's full of smoke, and we can't get a fire going. My boy, my youngest, Tim, his breathing is bad." Willa did not hesitate. "Bring them here," she said. An hour later, the Miller family stumbled into her cabin. John, his wife Mary, and their 2 small children, wrapped in every blanket they owned but still shivering violently. Tim, the youngest, was pale, his breathing a shallow, rattling rasp. Willa led them not into the freezing main room, but to the door of her chamber. She pulled it open, and a wave of still, relatively warm air washed over them. Their expressions shifted from fear to utter astonishment. She settled them inside her small sanctuary, giving Mary and the children her cot. The warmth began to work on them immediately, unclenching their frozen muscles. Willa heated broth on a tiny spirit lamp she had, feeding it to the boy first, then to the others. For the first time in weeks, the Millers were safe and warm, but Willa knew that charity was not enough. To simply shelter them would be to leave them as vulnerable as before. The knowledge was the only thing of real value she had to offer. The next morning, as the children slept soundly in the steady warmth, she took John Miller outside and showed him everything. She explained the principle of the Earth's thermal mass, just as Thomas had explained it to her. She showed him the construction of the walls, the careful chinking, the simple but crucial ventilation pipe. "The snow is your friend," she told him, pointing to the deep drifts covering the roof of her chamber. "It's the best insulation there is. Your root cellar, is it dug into a bank?" He nodded, his eyes alight with a dawning understanding. "Then you can do this. You can build a small chamber off it, seal it tight. It won't be as good as this, not right away, but it will be warm enough." She gave him a portion of her own clay and straw mixture. She taught him how to look for the right kind of stones. She was not just giving him aid, she was giving him the means of his own salvation. John Miller was a practical man, a quick learner. He and his family stayed with Willa for 2 days while he worked with her guidance to reinforce a section of his own root cellar. When they left, they carried with them not just renewed hope, but a new understanding of the world. Word of what had happened and what Willard had taught him spread through the valley with the speed of a Chinook wind. People began to arrive at her door, not for handouts, but for knowledge. She became the quiet, unassuming center of the community's survival, teaching every visitor what she knew about the patient, life-giving warmth of the earth. The final reckoning came at the end of February, when the long siege of cold had broken all but the most resilient. A wagon moving slowly through the deep, rutted snow made its way to her cabin. It was Silas and Elspeth. They looked diminished, their faces etched with a fatigue that went deeper than the cold. Their fine wool coats were worn, their expressions stripped of their former arrogance. They did not approach the cabin with the confidence of owners, but with the shuffling hesitation of supplicants. Silas stopped 10 feet from the door, unable to meet her gaze. "Our well froze solid 2 weeks ago," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "We've been melting snow, but the firewood, we miscalculated, we're almost out." Elspeth, for her part, simply stared at the ground, a portrait of silent humiliation. Their large, handsome house on the other side of the valley, built to be impressive rather than practical, had become a trap of ice. They were not asking for help directly. Their pride would not allow it. They were simply stating the fact of their failure, a confession delivered to the one person they had been so certain would fail. Willa looked at them for a long moment. She saw not the people who had tried to dispossess her, but 2 more victims of the winter, humbled by the same indifferent force she had learned to accommodate. She opened the cabin door wider. "There's hot broth on the stove," she said. Her tone was not one of triumph or pity. It was a simple statement of fact, an offer of impartial care. She took them in. She led them into the main cabin, which was cold but no longer hostile, and gave them each a steaming mug. She did not take them into her warm chamber. That was a sanctuary, not a stage for their humiliation. She treated them with the same quiet, detached courtesy she would have offered any stranger in need. This simple, equal treatment was the most profound verdict she could have delivered. There was no gloating, no speech about comeuppance. Her survival and her willingness to extend its comfort to them was the only judgment necessary. They stayed for an hour, drinking the broth in silence, and then they left. When spring finally came, melting the snow and revealing a green and wounded world, a delegation from the valley led by John Miller went to the county seat. They filed affidavits, sworn testimonies to the fact that Willa Graves had not only survived the harshest winter in memory through her own skill and ingenuity, but that she had saved others. Faced with the unanimous, granite-solid support of the community, Silas's legal claim evaporated. He and Elspeth, ostracized by the silent judgment of their neighbors, did not contest it. The deed to the homestead was affirmed in Willa's name, secured not by a lawyer's argument, but by the undeniable proof of competence and the moral weight of shared survival. The winter of 1884 passed into a valley legend, a new benchmark against which all other hardships were measured, and the story of that winter was inseparable from the story of Willa Graves. Time accelerated, as it does when survival gives way to life. She never left the homestead. The small stone chamber, which the valley folk came to call Willa's room, became a permanent part of the property. The following summer, with the help of John Miller and his sons, she connected it to the main cabin with a short, insulated stone tunnel, just as Thomas had planned. She installed a small, efficient stove inside it, not because it was necessary for survival, but for the comfort of a dry, radiant heat. She lived on that land for another 50 years, a quiet and respected figure. She never remarried, finding a sufficiency in her own judgment and the rhythms of her life. People from other settlements, having heard the story, would sometimes make the journey to her door, and she would teach anyone who asked the principles of the Earth's warmth, believing the knowledge belonged to anyone who needed it. In 1902, a writer from a Denver newspaper, collecting stories of frontier resilience, spent a week with her, documenting her methods. The article, syndicated across the country, brought her a measure of fame she neither sought nor encouraged. Offers came to lecture, to consult, but she politely declined them all. The knowledge was not for sale. The lives of the others in her story continued their own trajectories. Silas and Elspeth sold their large, cold house a year after the Great Winter and moved back east, vanishing from the valley's history. John Miller's youngest son, Tim, the boy whose cough had brought his desperate father to her door, grew up to become a master carpenter and builder, known throughout the region for his well-insulated, intelligently sited structures that honored the lessons of that terrible winter. Cinder, the small gray cat who had been the key, lived to a venerable age, always sleeping in the warmest spot in the earthen room, a silent companion to the end. Willa grew old. Her hair turned the color of snow, her hands became gnarled, but her eyes remained clear. In her last years, she often sat in her rocking chair in the stone room, thinking of Thomas. She understood now that his greatest legacy was not the cabin or the land, but the piece of fundamental truth he had shared with her on a summer afternoon, a truth that had become the foundation of her entire life. She died in her sleep on a cold March night in 1935, at the age of 82, warm and secure in the room he had inadvertently built for her. The homestead was sold, and the old cabin was eventually torn down. But the new owners, clearing the land, found the stone-lined room dug into the hillside. They opened the heavy door and stepped inside. The air was cool, still, and smelled of earth. On a nail in the wall, an old thermometer, its glass clouded with age, still hung. Its mercury line rested, as it had for half a century, at a steady 50 degrees, a final, wordless confirmation of a knowledge that had outlasted its keeper, a quiet promise of warmth held patiently within the earth.